There are days when the sky seems clearer than usual, the air crisper, and the world feels like it's holding its breath for something important. For Noah Franklin, today was that kind of day. At only 16, Noah had already learned to carry himself with a quiet dignity beyond his years. The kind of maturity that doesn't scream, doesn't boast, but settles in silently like a well-tailored suit. As he stepped onto the plane, boarding pass in hand, there was no entourage, no flash of privilege, just a composed young man dressed in a navy hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of clean white sneakers. To the casual observer, he looked like any regular teen. But today, Noah wasn't just any passenger. He was seated in 1A, first class, front row, window seat, a position that often symbolized status, wealth, and seniority. And this seat wasn't just about comfort, it was a gift. It had been a long academic year, and Noah had poured every ounce of effort into his classes and extracurriculars. When he told his father he'd made the dean's list and been invited to a national leadership summit, David Franklin, CEO of Franklin Dynamics, simply smiled, nodded, and booked his son in the most prestigious spot on the plane. "This isn't just a chair," David had told him the night before. "It's a reminder of what you've earned and who you are. You sit there with your back straight, your head high, and your values intact, no matter who questions you." As Noah settled into the buttery leather of seat 1A, he remembered those words. The flight attendants were still greeting passengers. The cabin was pristine, muted gold lighting, polished wooden panels, plush carpeting that softened every step. A sense of calm filled the first-class section. Noah leaned back slightly, glancing out the oval window to watch the ground crew finish their preparations. He wasn't nervous, but he was mindful. It was his first time flying alone, and that independence carried a weight, one he welcomed. A flight attendant approached. She was professional and friendly, and her posture was relaxed. "Good morning, Mr. Franklin," she said warmly, reading the name off the manifest. "Would you like something to drink before takeoff?" Noah blinked, momentarily surprised at the use of Mr., but offered a polite smile. "Orange juice, please." She nodded and disappeared down the aisle. Within moments, a glass of perfectly chilled orange juice, with a neatly folded napkin underneath, was placed on his armrest. He accepted it with a soft, "Thank you," careful not to spill a drop as he settled in. Sipping slowly, Noah felt a swell of quiet pride. It wasn't about luxury, it was about legacy. This seat had been reserved for him, not because he demanded it, but because someone believed he was worth it. He looked out at the tarmac. The morning sunlight had begun to stretch across the horizon, casting long golden shadows behind the aircraft. He could see airport staff moving rhythmically like dancers in a silent ballet, each action timed with perfect coordination. And above it all, a quiet stillness held the moment together. It was the kind of silence that speaks not of emptiness, but of expectation. Noah smiled. He didn't know what awaited him at the summit, but he was ready to represent his school, his city, and his family. He had been taught the value of humility and the strength of self-respect. His father didn't raise him to chase attention, but to stand firm when it found him. What Noah didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that not everyone believed he belonged there. Further down the terminal, at Gate 1, a woman named Clara Vaughn clicked her heels across the boarding bridge with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. She wore a cream-colored trench coat, cinched perfectly at the waist, and carried a matching designer handbag embossed with gold initials. Her movements were swift, practiced, like a politician entering a donor gala. Clara had flown first class with this airline for over a decade. She was a Platinum Elite member, known by name by many flight crews. Seat 1A, as far as she was concerned, was her unofficial, of course, but established by years of priority upgrades and VIP treatment. The staff usually greeted her with small talk, offered her favorite champagne, and ensured no inconvenience dared touch her morning travel. But today, something, or something, was sitting where she believed she always belonged. As Clara stepped onto the plane, her eyes scanned the cabin with expectation. Her smile, poised and subtle, flickered slightly when her gaze landed on Noah. He was seated comfortably, sipping orange juice, his face turned toward the window, unaware of the approaching storm. Clara paused, Her brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in offense. She took another step forward, her heels echoing louder now, drawing the attention of those nearby. The smile had vanished from her face. In its place was a sharp line of disapproval. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough to slice through the quiet ambiance of first class. "I believe there's been a mistake." Heads turned slightly. A businessman 2 rows back glanced over his newspaper. Another woman adjusted her seatbelt slowly, eyes flicking toward the front of the cabin. The flight attendant who had just served Noah returned with a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Clara gestured stiffly toward Noah. "That seat, 1A, it's usually assigned to me. I always sit there. I'm Platinum Elite. This must be an error." The attendant, trained to maintain composure in any situation, nodded calmly. "Let me just check the manifest for you." She tapped the tablet on her hip, her eyes scanning. "No, ma'am," she said after a beat. "Seat 1A is confirmed for Mr. Noah Franklin. It was reserved in advance." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Reserved? For him?" The word lingered, heavy with implication. Noah turned from the window slowly. His gaze met hers, not with confrontation, but curiosity. There was something in her tone that made his fingers tighten ever so slightly around the glass. Clara took a deep breath. Then, with a practiced smile that barely concealed her disdain, she said loudly enough for others to hear, "Well, I think it's time someone reviewed the seating arrangements." And just like that, the serenity of the cabin fractured. Noah remained still. The moment had arrived. What began as a routine boarding would soon become a defining lesson in power, prejudice, and quiet strength. There's a moment in every confrontation when words don't just fill the air, they rearrange it. The tone sharpens, the silence stretches, and even the hum of an airplane cabin becomes deafening. That moment had arrived, and Noah Franklin was sitting squarely in the middle of it. Still holding the now warm glass of orange juice, he glanced down at the napkin in his lap, a simple, creased square of white cotton. Nothing more than a detail, but at that moment, it grounded him. He placed the glass gently onto the tray table, folded his hands, and looked up at Clara Vaughn. His expression was unreadable, not defensive, not afraid, just still. Clara, on the other hand, was far from still. Her shoulders stiffened, her painted lips tightened, and her fingers gripped the strap of her handbag like it was a sword she might need to draw. Years of entitlement, of walking into rooms and being welcomed, seated, and served without question, had left her unprepared for this kind of stall. "Miss Vaughn," the flight attendant said again, her voice as calm as still water, "I assure you, seat 1A has been correctly assigned. Mr. Franklin has every right to be seated there." "Assigned by whom?" Clara snapped. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor. Now." The attendant gave a courteous nod. "Of course. I'll notify our head purser." With that, she walked briskly to the galley, leaving Clara standing just inches from Noah. The silence between them now pulsed with unspoken tension. Noah didn't break eye contact. He didn't look away. But he didn't escalate either. It was the kind of poise you don't learn from books or school. It's inherited, taught by generations who've had to survive moments just like this, with grace in one hand and restraint in the other. "I suppose your family pulled some strings?" Clara asked, the edge in her voice cutting through her faux composure. "Or did someone just feel sorry for you?" Noah raised an eyebrow just slightly. "My name was on the ticket," he said softly. "No strings, no favors, just a reservation made early and paid in full." His voice was low, steady, the kind of calm that made Clara bristle, because it reminded him without a word that she wasn't in control of this moment. Before she could respond, a second flight attendant approached, older, more experienced, with the gold wings of a senior purser pinned neatly above her name tag, Elaine Rogers. She assessed the situation immediately. One glance at Clara's rigid posture, another at Noah's quiet resolve. And in the seconds that followed, Elaine made a decision, not just about seats or status, but about where dignity stood on this plane. "Good morning," Elaine said smoothly. "I'm Elaine, the lead purser on this flight. I understand there's a concern about the seating?" "Yes," Clara said, stepping forward as if Elaine were her long-awaited rescue. There's been a mistake. That seat, 1A, is always mine. I've flown this airline for 14 years, and I always sit there. You know that, Elaine remained courteous. And we value your loyalty deeply, Miss Vaughn. Truly. But today, seat 1A was purchased and reserved under Mr. Franklin's name. The manifest confirms it. Clara's nostrils flared. Are you telling me that someone just booked it like that? No priority consideration? No recognition of my history with this airline? Elaine offered a small practiced smile. Priority seating is based on availability and timing. Mr. Franklin booked his seat 10 days ago, well within our reservation window. It's not a matter of loyalty, ma'am. It's logistics. That was the first real blow. Clara wasn't used to being reminded she was subject to the same rules as everyone else, that perhaps she wasn't untouchable. Her gaze drifted back to Noah, now sitting a little straighter. Not out of arrogance, but readiness. Fine, Clara said at last, eyes narrowing. Then I'd like to switch seats. He can move. Elaine blinked. I'm sorry? He's young. I'm sure he doesn't mind sitting elsewhere, maybe economy or an exit row. I have spinal issues. I need extra space. It was a lie, a performance, and a poor one at that. Noah looked at Elaine and then at Clara. His voice was even. I'm not moving, he said. This seat was assigned to me. It's mine. The words weren't loud, but the weight of them? Immense. Elaine nodded once respectfully. That's his right, Miss Vaughn. We can find you another seat in first class if one is available. But not that one? Clara pressed, pointing. No, ma'am, Elaine replied. Not that one. The line was drawn, not in anger, not on fire, but in quiet resolve. Clara's face turned cold. The carefully maintained mask of superiority slipped, and in its place came a flicker of something darker, resentment. She muttered something under her breath, something no one could quite hear, but everyone felt. And then, with a sharp snap of her heels, she turned and followed Elaine toward the rear of first class. The moment she was gone, the air felt thinner. The silence that had pressed down on the cabin lifted slightly, but it wasn't over. Noah exhaled slowly and looked back out the window. The ground crew was finishing up. The jet bridge would soon retract. The flight would take off. But already the real journey had begun. In seat 1A, Noah wasn't just a passenger. He was a symbol of change, of resistance, of the right to take up space. And somewhere in the back of the plane, Clara Vaughn was fuming, not just because she didn't get her seat, but because for the first time in years someone had quietly told her, no. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. Outside, the sky was a rich blue tapestry fading into dusk, but inside seat 1A, the storm had only just begun to brew. Noah Franklin sat with his seatbelt fastened, earbuds in, the soft chords of Miles Davis filling the space between him and the rest of the world. His posture was calm, his face unreadable, but inside, a quiet calculation churned. He knew what had just happened wasn't over, not by a long shot. Across the aisle, passengers were murmuring in low tones. A few had observed the scene. Most had pretended not to, but all had felt the disturbance ripple through first class like a crack in a glass of still water. And Clara Vaughn? She was no longer in seat 1A, but her presence was far from absent. 2 rows back, in seat 3C, she sat with her arms folded across her designer blouse, lips pressed into a line so tight it seemed drawn with a ruler. Her assistant, young, mousy, and visibly uncomfortable, sat beside her, scrolling through emails but distracted. Every few seconds, Clara leaned in and whispered something. Her voice was a snake in silk, low, poisonous, deliberate. He didn't even earn that seat, she hissed. You know how the world works, don't you, Rebecca? People like him, they don't just get things unless someone hands it to them. Rebecca blinked hard but said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly over the keyboard. Clara smirked, mistaking the silence for agreement. Well, she added, he'll learn, one way or another. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, securing items and checking belts before takeoff. Elaine Rogers passed by and glanced at Clara, offering the same professional smile she had given every passenger. But Clara didn't smile back. Instead, she handed over a small folded piece of paper, tucked between 2 fingers like a secret. Elaine raised an eyebrow, then took it silently, as trained. As she walked away, Clara leaned back, eyes half-lidded with calculated satisfaction. The plane lifted off moments later, smooth and steady, a climb into the sky that felt, for most passengers, like the beginning of a calm evening journey. But Noah felt something shift. It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't gravity. It was tension, thin, covert, and coiling. 10 minutes after reaching cruising altitude, Elaine returned, gently tapping Noah's shoulder. "Mr. Franklin," she said softly, "may I have a quick word with you in the galley?" He blinked. "Of course." As he stood and followed her, heads subtly turned. Not overtly, just slight movements, but enough for him to feel them. In the privacy of the galley near the front, Elaine lowered her voice. "I received a complaint, Noah, from a passenger who claims you were confrontational earlier. She said you made a few inappropriate remarks." Noah's brows rose. "Excuse me?" Elaine held up a hand. "I know. I saw everything. And I don't believe it for a second. But protocol requires me to log it and notify the purser team. I wanted to speak to you first personally, so you weren't blindsided." A breath caught in Noah's chest. Not fear, but disbelief. "She's trying to create a record," he murmured. Elaine nodded, her voice quieter now. "That's exactly what it looks like." He exhaled slowly. "And let me guess, she has status high enough that if I react poorly, I become the problem." Elaine didn't answer directly, but her silence spoke volumes. Noah nodded once. "Thank you for telling me." She touched his arm gently. "You're not alone, okay? I'm documenting everything fairly." He returned to his seat, mind whirring. Not with panic, but preparation. He'd seen this tactic before. Not in airports, but in meetings, schools, and even social spaces, where confrontation doesn't end with a scene, but continues with whispers, written complaints, and carefully crafted lies designed to shift the story. He looked over his shoulder briefly. Clara was sipping wine now, eyes half-lidded in faux relaxation. She saw him look. She smiled. It was not a smile of warmth. It was a smile of warning. The kind that says, "You may have won the first round, but I know how to play the long game." Noah turned back to the window, jaw tightening slightly. He wasn't just holding his ground anymore. He was preparing for a second attack. And it would come, not in volume or force, but in paper trails, subtle sabotage, and attempts to make him look like the one out of line. But Clara didn't know the most important part. He was his father's son, and he wasn't alone. The hum of the engines was steady, almost comforting. But inside the cabin, the air had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Noah Franklin sat in seat 1A, posture relaxed but heart quietly braced. His fingers traced the edges of the boarding pass now folded neatly in the seat pocket before him, a simple reminder that this space was his. Earned, paid for, and rightfully his. But justice, as he knew too well, wasn't always safe in silence. 3 rows back, Clara Vaughn moved like a conductor in an invisible symphony of influence. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't storming. She was far more dangerous than that. She was calculating. And now she was dialing. Her assistant, Rebecca, leaned over with an anxious whisper. "Clara, maybe this isn't the right place." Clara didn't flinch. "The right place," she said coolly, "is wherever I say it is." She lifted her phone, tapped the speaker icon, and held it slightly angled for those near enough to hear the opening chime. The call connected. "Garrett," Clara said smoothly. "It's Clara. I need you to prep a media statement." Rebecca blinked, her lips parting in alarm. Garrett's voice came through the speaker, a practiced PR tone, warm but crisp. "Of course. What's going on?" Clara glanced briefly toward the front of the plane. Her voice lowered, but not enough. "I've just been publicly disrespected and displaced by a teenager in a premium cabin. First class, seat 1A. I was told, no, I was forced to give up my rightful seat to a minor whose only asset is a last name. You understand the optics, Garrett. It's time the public hears how even our elite loyalty means nothing anymore." Rebecca's face turned pale. A few nearby passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen, but very clearly listening. Noah, hearing the tail end of Clara's statement, closed his eyes for a moment. His fingers tightened slightly on the armrest, not with fear but with resolve. She wasn't just trying to move him now. She was trying to rewrite the story, turn the press against him, discredit him, smear him. Deborah Lane, the new purser who had returned to the cabin, stood just a few feet away, arms folded, listening without a word. Her face was professional, but her jaw had a small, tight line. She'd heard the call too. Clara clicked the phone off, then turned to Rebecca. "I want it in the inbox of 3 travel editors by the time we land," she said coolly. "Use the headline, 'Elite passenger pushed aside for preferential child. Airline loyalty broken?'" Rebecca swallowed. "Clara, are you sure this is the right way?" "I'm always sure," Clara snapped. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Noah turned toward Deborah, who now stood in the aisle. He spoke quietly. "Did you hear that?" "I did," Deborah replied, "and I'm documenting it, every word." Noah gave a small nod. "Then I'd like to make a formal request to speak with the captain, privately." Deborah hesitated. "I understand the hierarchy," Noah added, "but if my name is about to be publicly dragged through the media by someone abusing her power, I want it on record that I've done nothing but sit quietly in the seat my father booked." The confidence in his tone didn't come from arrogance. It came from the truth. Deborah met his gaze. For the first time since the incident began, she looked not just like a staff member, but like someone ashamed of her silence. "I'll inform the captain," she said quietly. Back in row 3, Clara was now sipping a second glass of white wine. Her cheeks glowed, not from alcohol, but from adrenaline, the power of narrative already building in her mind. She believed, fully and without doubt, that she would win. After all, she had the press. She had the years. She had the connections. But what she didn't have was the truth, or the voice that was about to rise behind it. 10 minutes later, the cockpit door opened gently. Captain Sean Whitaker, a tall, composed man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a calm intensity in his expression, walked down the aisle toward seat 1A. The cabin quieted. People noticed. Even Clara noticed. He approached Noah first. "Mr. Franklin?" Noah stood respectfully. "Yes, sir." "I understand there's been a situation," the captain said. "Would you mind joining me briefly in the forward galley?" Noah nodded and followed. Behind him, Clara smirked. "About time," she whispered under her breath. But her smirk wouldn't last long. Inside the galley, the captain spoke low and firm. "I've reviewed the reports from the crew. I've heard from the purser. And I want to hear from you. Exactly what happened." Noah, calm but composed, recounted everything, from the moment Clara confronted him, to the complaints she filed, to the recent phone call to the media. When he finished, the captain looked him in the eye and said something Noah hadn't expected, but would never forget. "You've shown more maturity and composure than most adults I've met. Thank you for staying calm." Noah exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then the captain added, "I'll take it from here." Back in first class, Clara sat expectantly, until she saw him walking toward her. Captain Whitaker. His footsteps didn't waver. When he stopped beside her row, the room fell silent. Passengers watched with careful, sharpened curiosity. And in that moment, Clara smiled. Too early, because the next words, delivered with clarity and weight, didn't affirm her narrative. They shattered it. Clara Vaughan's confidence was a living thing. It sat with her like an expensive shawl, elegant, powerful, and suffocating to anyone who dared question her authority. So when Captain Sean Whitaker stopped by her row, she didn't flinch, didn't blink. She even tilted her chin upward, a soft, anticipatory smile resting on her lips. She was ready for vindication. What she wasn't ready for was the silence that preceded it. Not the professional kind. No, this was something heavier. A silence that felt like the pause before a verdict, a courtroom hush, a collective breath held in midair. Captain Whitaker looked down at Clara with a gaze that was neither angry nor pleased, just measured, like a man who had seen too much to be impressed by posturing. "Ms. Vaughn," he said, his voice steady, "I've reviewed the situation, spoken to the crew, and listened to the recordings. I've also spoken with the young man in seat 1A. Clara's smile flickered, but she held her ground. Yes, she said, as though welcoming the conversation. And I trust that your findings will reflect what occurred. A deeply inappropriate reassignment of priority boarding protocol. I was humiliated in front of other passengers. Captain Whitaker nodded slowly. I agree that something inappropriate happened, but not to you. A beat of silence. Clara blinked. I beg your pardon? The captain's tone remained level. You were not displaced from your seat, Ms. Vaughn. Our records show you were originally booked in seat 1C, not 1A. Your profile was upgraded automatically due to flight load, but the seat was already secured by Mr. Franklin's reservation. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. Her brain scrambled for footing. That's impossible. I always book 1A. Always. I'm a top-tier platinum. And yet, Captain Whitaker interrupted gently, this morning's record doesn't reflect that. Your profile was adjusted mid-flight by our gate system. A clerical shuffle. But the initial assignment stood. Mr. Franklin did not steal your seat. Passengers were listening now, openly. Some had put their books down. Others leaned slightly into the aisle. Noah, still seated at the front, remained still. Captain Whitaker continued. Furthermore, the purser and two attendants reported hearing you refer to Mr. Franklin as a boy and undeserving while attempting to assert your preference. That language, Ms. Vaughn, is unacceptable, especially toward a minor. Clara's face tightened. I never meant it racially. Intent is important, the captain said, but so is impact. Another silence. And then, for the first time, Clara looked around and realized the tide had turned. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the headline. The captain nodded once more. You will remain in your seat for the remainder of this flight. Upon arrival, a senior liaison from our airline's conflict resolution team will be waiting for you. They'll take your statement and issue ours. Clara bristled. Are you threatening me? Captain Whitaker's reply was cool and quiet. No, ma'am. I'm protecting every passenger's right to travel without fear, bias, or humiliation, including yours. But that protection goes both ways. And with that, he turned and walked away. The silence in the cabin held a second longer, until it finally broke with the quiet rustling of newspapers, shifting knees, and a hushed wow from somewhere in the back. Clara didn't speak for the next hour. Neither did anyone else. Because what had just occurred wasn't only about a seat. It was about something much deeper. Unspoken assumptions, unchecked power, and a young black passenger who had held his ground without ever raising his voice. Later in the flight, Deborah Lane approached Noah again, this time with a small envelope. This came from the captain, she said softly. Noah opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. You showed the kind of character we hope to see in every generation to come. Don't let the loud ones define the world. SWBU. Noah folded it carefully. Thank you, he whispered. Deborah paused. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. He looked at her and then back at the window. It's never too late to start doing the right thing. Just then, a passenger across the aisle, an older woman in her 70s, dressed in a lavender cardigan, leaned over. I just want to say, she said, voice low but clear, you handled all of that with such grace. I don't know your story, but I'm proud of you. Noah nodded, humbled. Thank you, ma'am. She smiled. Keep making people uncomfortable, in the right way. As the flight began its descent, the clouds outside rolled in gentle layers, and a kind of stillness settled over the cabin. Not awkwardness, something more thoughtful. Like a collective shift had occurred, a momentary opening in the minds of those who watched. For Clara, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for Noah, a new kind of peace had taken root. Not a victory over someone else, but a quiet affirmation of who he was becoming. A young man no longer just reacting to the world, but shaping how it remembered him. Noah sat back in seat 1A, his fingers still slightly trembling from the confrontation. Though his posture remained composed, his heartbeat was irregular, heavy, pounding against his ribcage with the weight of 1,000 emotions. For the first time since boarding, he felt truly alone. Not because there were no people around, but because not one of them had stood up for him. Not one had said, "This isn't right." But he remembered his father's words. Quiet wisdom offered so many times at the breakfast table, and during late-night drives after school debates. When silence surrounds you, let your values speak louder. So that's what he held on to. Still, his instincts told him this wasn't a battle he needed to fight alone. With a deep breath, Noah reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out his phone, and stared at the screen. For a moment, his thumb hovered over the contact labeled Dad, Arthur Franklin. He hesitated. Not because he feared his father's reaction. Quite the opposite. He knew exactly what would happen. Arthur Franklin was not just any father. He was a man who had risen from being a scholarship student at a public school in Detroit to becoming the CEO of Nova North Industries, one of the most influential tech conglomerates in the country. A man known for his unshakable ethics and steel-like resolve. A man who, despite his towering responsibilities, never missed his son's school recitals or late-night phone calls. With one final exhale, Noah pressed call. It rang only once. Noah, came the warm but alert voice on the other end. Arthur's tone was always gentle when it came to his son, but beneath it lay an ocean of authority. Dad, Noah started, trying to keep his voice steady. There's a situation. Arthur's voice immediately shifted, his attentiveness sharp. Are you safe? Is the plane in the air? I'm safe, Noah assured him quickly. But a woman named Miranda Collins tried to take my seat. She said I didn't belong here. The crew sided with her. They're trying to make me move. A pause, then Arthur's voice, calm but ironclad. You stay in that seat. I'll take care of the rest. Those were all the words Noah needed to hear. That promise, simple as it was, came with the full weight of a man whose phone calls could shift markets and make world leaders pause. As Noah ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, something inside him solidified. Not just resolve, but pride. He had stood his ground. Now he would witness what dignity looked like when backed by truth and power. Miles away, in a towering glass-walled office overlooking downtown Chicago, Arthur Franklin stood up from a meeting in progress. I need the room, he said to the executives seated around a mahogany table. His tone was courteous but absolute. No one questioned him. The moment the door closed behind the last person, Arthur picked up his private line and dialed the number of a senior contact at Astrosky Airlines, the company operating Noah's flight. It was a man named Leonard McClellan, an old acquaintance and the current executive vice president of global operations. Arthur, came Leonard's voice. Always good to hear from you. What can I do for you today? Arthur skipped the niceties. My son is on your flight 217 to Seattle, seat 1A. He was just harassed and nearly displaced by another passenger. Worse, your crew enabled it. I need this resolved, immediately. There was a pause, the kind of silence that only occurs when a powerful man realizes he might be standing in a fire he didn't see coming. I wasn't aware of any situation, Arthur, Leonard said quickly, a hint of unease creeping into his voice. But I assure you, I'll find out what's going on right now and intervene at once. I'm not looking for promises, Leonard. I want accountability. I expect a direct apology delivered to my son on that flight. And if your crew cannot uphold basic decency, they shouldn't be on that aircraft. Leonard swallowed hard. Understood. I'll send a team on board immediately. Good. And Leonard, Arthur added, his voice now chillingly firm, if I find out that this situation was racial, and all signs point to that, it won't just be your employees answering for it. Your board and shareholders will hear from me too. With that, the call ended. Back on board, the energy in the VIP cabin shifted again, this time not from hostility, but unease. Something was happening. An attendant walked quickly to the front of the aircraft and whispered to the supervisor. Within minutes, two sharply dressed men boarded the plane, flashing silver badges marked with the airline's executive crest. Their presence sent a silent ripple through the first-class cabin. Noah remained quiet, his gaze fixed calmly on the horizon outside. But he heard the sudden hush, the whispers, the movement, and then soft leather shoes stepped toward his row. Noah Franklin? One of the men asked, crouching beside him. Yes, he replied, not with fear, but with polite firmness. My name is Charles Henley. I'm part of Astrosky Airlines' executive affairs team. I want to personally apologize for the way you've been treated. We've been informed of the incident, and it's being handled with utmost seriousness. At the same time, another representative approached Miranda Collins. Her confident expression faltered. Her lips parted to speak, but no words came. The air had changed, and she could feel it. "What is this about?" she managed to ask. "Mrs. Collins," the second executive said coolly, "we are investigating a serious violation of our passenger policy. For now, we request that you return to your assigned seat and cease further interference with other guests. But we are not discussing this further in public. Any continued disruption will result in removal from this flight." It was as if all the sound had been drained from the air. Passengers who had earlier turned their heads in polite disinterest now watched in absolute silence. Noah sat quietly through it all, sipping his orange juice. For the first time since takeoff, he smiled, not because Miranda had been shut down, but because he knew he wasn't alone. Justice had boarded the plane. The moment the door swung open and the two sharply dressed airline executives stepped into the first-class cabin, the entire atmosphere shifted. It was as if the weight of silence pressed harder on every shoulder. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes from row one to the back curtain locked onto the scene unfolding. Elijah turned his head slowly toward the men. His face, once tight with anxiety, now held a flicker of hope. The taller of the two stepped forward. His navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, the crest of the airline subtly gleaming on his lapel. He carried himself with calm authority, scanning the cabin with steely eyes. Then his voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Good afternoon. I am Richard Hale, Chief Operating Officer of Jetlux Airlines. With me is Marlon Keyes, Director of In-Flight Services. We received a direct report of an incident involving passenger rights. We are here to address it in person." The finality in Hale's tone left no doubt. This was no routine inspection. This was accountability arriving with polished shoes and clipped words. Flight Supervisor Carla Monroe visibly stiffened. Her fingers gripped the service tablet in her hand as though it could shield her from what was coming. She had already sensed it during the heated moments earlier, but now her fate stood one breath away from unfolding. Next to her, Flight Attendant Sam Whitaker looked pale. His earlier smug confidence had drained into nervous shifting. Neither he nor Carla had expected upper management to show up mid-flight. But what neither realized was that the call Elijah had made hadn't just gone to his father. It had ignited a fuse. "May I speak to the passenger involved?" Hale asked, turning to Elijah with a softening expression. "Are you Mr. Elijah Cross?" Elijah stood slowly. "Yes, sir, that's me." "Would you be willing to describe what happened?" Hale asked, his voice respectful, neutral. Elijah nodded. His voice, while calm, held a quiet conviction that silenced the entire row. "I was seated in 1A. My ticket was properly scanned, but I was asked to give up my seat for Mrs. Langford. When I refused politely, I was told that I was being uncooperative and disrespectful. I was threatened with removal. Even after the crew verified my seat assignment, they continued pressuring me to move." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Hale glanced at Marlon Keyes, who opened a thin tablet and tapped rapidly, pulling up a flight manifest and customer log. "Mr. Cross is listed here with seat 1A booked under a priority gold account," Keyes confirmed. "His father, Miles Cross, is the CEO of Crestfall Dynamics, a major client of ours. The seat was not upgraded. It was paid and confirmed through his corporate plan." The confirmation hit like a silent explosion. The murmurs in the cabin transformed. Disapproval turned on Carla and Sam, and even on the still-seated Mrs. Langford, who looked like she was trying to disappear into her high-collared coat. Hale turned next to Carla Monroe. "Supervisor Monroe, please explain, why was this passenger's valid seat questioned?" Carla swallowed hard, trying to maintain composure. "Mrs. Langford is a Platinum Ambassador member. She frequently sits in 1A and expected that seat again today. When she saw a younger passenger seated there, she assumed it was an error. I tried to resolve the situation discreetly. By asking a confirmed passenger to relinquish his seat based on an assumption?" Hale asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "It was a moment of pressure. I was trying to prevent escalation." "You escalated it," Hale responded coolly. "You overstepped authority and sided with a disruptive passenger rather than protecting a rightful one." Carla's voice faltered. "I didn't intend—" But Hale lifted a hand. "Intent doesn't override outcome, Supervisor." Then his gaze turned to Sam. "And you, Mr. Whitaker, What actions did you take to de-escalate or advocate for Mr. Cross? Sam opened his mouth, then closed it. His silence was answer enough. The passengers leaned in, watching the reckoning unfold. Mrs. Langford turned her head away, as though the air had become too sharp to breathe. We are officially placing both of you under review, Hale continued. You are relieved of supervisory and attendant duties for the remainder of this flight. A report will be submitted to HR immediately following landing. Please return to your quarters. Sam paled, but Carla spoke up, the desperation finally cracking her voice. Sir, please. I've been with Jetlux for 12 years. I was trying to manage the optics of a VIP customer. I didn't mean to offend. You didn't offend, Hale said, his voice colder now. You failed. And in doing so, you placed our brand and our passengers in jeopardy. Then turning to Elijah, he said gently, Mr. Cross, on behalf of Jetlux Airlines, I offer you our deepest and most sincere apologies. We recognize the mistreatment you've endured today. It was wrong. We are initiating internal reforms, starting now. Elijah felt the knot in his chest loosen. He gave a small nod, humbled but not triumphant. The cabin began to shift. Passengers nodded. One older man tapped Elijah's shoulder and whispered, Well done, son. A woman from 1C leaned forward and smiled. You handled this with grace. But it wasn't over. Richard Hale wasn't done. He turned to the passengers and made an unexpected announcement. For the disturbance and delay caused today, Jetlux will issue a $250 voucher to each passenger in first class, effective upon landing. This should have never happened. The ripple of surprise turned into low applause. Then Hale walked back to Elijah, paused, and said quietly, Your father called. His message was simple. My son deserves what's right, not because he's my son, but because he's a paying, dignified human being. We agree. For the first time, Elijah smiled. And when he sat back down in seat 1A, there was no longer a sense of isolation, only a quiet, overwhelming sense of pride, not arrogance, not revenge, just the quiet dignity of someone who had stood his ground and been heard. The cabin door shut firmly behind Lucas and the security officers, sealing away the chaos and fury of the past hour like the lid on a boiling pot. But the tension didn't vanish instantly. For a few long seconds, the passengers sat frozen in their seats, processing what they had just witnessed. The young man in seat 1A, Julian Blackwell, was no longer merely a boy. He had become a symbol, a quiet storm that refused to be silenced. Captain Reynolds adjusted his uniform as he returned to the cockpit, his expression tight but proud. Robert Evans and Nadine Clark lingered near the front, exchanging brief, meaningful glances. Nadine, though stern, couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips. Justice had taken flight. Finally. Julian remained in his seat, hands folded in his lap, staring out the window. The orange hues of the setting sun bathed his face, casting shadows that danced across the contours of his cheekbones. There was no smugness in his expression, no gloating, only a quiet, composed calm. Calm, the kind born from enduring, not winning. Beside him, an elderly gentleman leaned forward slightly and whispered, You held your ground like a true gentleman. Don't let this world ever shake that out of you. Julian turned, offered a gentle nod and a soft smile, the kind that said more than any words ever could. Back in the galley, whispers fluttered among the remaining crew. The firings of Supervisor Dana Fletcher and Senior Attendant Craig Simmons had shaken them. Some were scared, others were quietly relieved. The rot had been exposed, and now for the first time in years, change didn't feel like an impossible dream. Nadine Clark gathered her tablet and documents, then made her way to Julian's seat. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to his eye level. Julian, she said softly, her voice carrying both authority and warmth. On behalf of Horizon Airlines, I want to offer you a formal apology. Once again, what happened to you was wrong on every level. You were treated unfairly because of how you look, not who you are. That should never happen on any flight or anywhere. Julian blinked slowly, his gaze steady. Thank you, ma'am. I didn't want to cause a scene. I just wanted to sit where I was supposed to. And you did exactly that. You showed restraint, Dignity and strength far beyond your years, she said. Your father should be proud. Julian's eyes softened and a flicker of a smile appeared. He is. At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of him, a vibration buzzed from Julian's pocket. He glanced down. A text message from his father, Malcolm Blackwell. Handled. Full statement from the airline going public tomorrow. Stay strong. Love you. Julian took a deep breath, let it out slowly. The weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter now. In the corporate tower of Blackwell Innovations, Malcolm Blackwell stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights flicker on like fireflies in the dusk. His phone still in hand, he replayed his conversation with the airline board in his mind. The firm demands, the uncompromising tone, the insistence that accountability must come with consequences. He hadn't threatened lawsuits. He hadn't needed to. The brand he had built stood for something. His silence would have been a betrayal, not just of Julian, but of every person who had ever been told to step aside because someone else thought they were more deserving. Back on the flight, Robert Evans returned to his seat, reviewing the formal report on his tablet. The disciplinary actions would be finalized before the plane touched down. Internal reform proposals were already being drafted, but something deeper shifted in him. Something personal. He had seen prejudice many times in his line of work, but never had it unfolded so plainly before his eyes. This time he had not looked away. Across the aisle, a woman reached for Julian's hand gently and said, "Your presence reminded us who deserves first class, not because of money, but because of grace." Julian offered another small smile, humbled by the unexpected support. "Thank you." A few rows behind him, murmurs continued, some praising, some embarrassed at their earlier silence. One man who had avoided eye contact during the ordeal leaned over to his wife and whispered, "That boy's father must be someone important." His wife, eyes locked on Julian, replied, "He is. But more importantly, that boy is important. You don't need a famous name to deserve dignity." As the flight finally began its descent toward New York, the passengers settled into their seats with a collective exhale. The twilight outside melted into indigo. Julian sat upright, buckled in, but this time his hands were relaxed. The quiet peace inside him mirrored the stillness of the clouds below. Flight attendant Maya, one of the junior staff who had remained quiet throughout the conflict but had always cast worried glances toward him, approached cautiously. She offered a warm towel, then whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I wanted to. I was scared." Julian looked up at her, his voice soft. "It's okay. I get it." Maya's eyes welled with gratitude. "You shouldn't have had to go through that, but I hope you know, you've changed something. All of us saw it." Julian gave her a reassuring nod. "Then it was worth it." The plane touched down at JFK International with a soft bump. A round of relieved applause broke out in the cabin, the kind that signaled more than just a safe landing. For many on board, it felt like the end of an emotional journey, and for Julian, it was the beginning of a new chapter. As the doors opened and the lights flickered on, passengers began to stand and retrieve their bags. Several of them paused near Julian's seat. A quiet nod, a whisper of, "Well done," a pat on the shoulder. He accepted them all with grace. Just as Julian stepped off the plane, a man in a crisp suit stood waiting at the gate, flanked by airport representatives. Malcolm Blackwell. He didn't rush. He simply opened his arms. Julian walked into the embrace and held on for a long, silent moment. "I'm proud of you," Malcolm said into his son's ear. Julian didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The calm strength that radiated from him said everything. As they walked down the terminal side by side, father and son, passengers watched them with a newfound respect. Not because of wealth or fame, but because of something rarer. Courage clothed in humility. The VIP cabin had descended into chaos. Evelyn was now practically shouting at every staff member. Passengers were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and whispers of discontent grew louder with every passing minute. Captain Reynolds, now visibly disturbed by the prolonged disruption, stepped forward once more. His tone had changed. It was no longer calm and measured. It was sharp, clear, and final. "Mrs. Stokes," he said firmly, "this is your final warning. If you continue to disturb the peace and safety of this cabin, I will be forced to have you removed from this flight." Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief. The reality of the threat hadn't registered until now. Her mouth opened as if to protest, but the words died in her throat. Still trembling with anger, she scanned the room for support, from the crew, from the passengers, but found only tight lips, averted gazes, and silent judgment. Seeing no backing, she turned to Mr. Evans, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and arrogance. "I am a Platinum Elite member. I've flown with this airline for over a decade. You can't treat me like this." But Robert Evans, the senior airline executive, had already reached his breaking point. He stepped forward, his voice echoing with the weight of authority. "Mrs. Stokes, after reviewing your actions, your threats, your disrespect to our staff, your disruption to every single person in this cabin, we are officially revoking your Platinum Elite status effective immediately." The entire cabin fell into stunned silence. Passengers gasped. Some exchanged shocked glances. A few nodded slowly, as if justice had finally taken shape. And Evelyn? Her face went ghostly pale. The color drained from her cheeks. Her jaw hung open. "You... what?" she stammered. Mr. Evans didn't waver. "You have abused the privileges this status offers. Loyalty to an airline does not entitle you to violate the rights of others. This decision is final." For a moment, Evelyn seemed paralyzed. Her legs shook beneath her designer heels. Then her face contorted with rage as she began to scream incoherently. Her voice shrieked across the cabin, calling for lawyers, the media, justice. "I'll sue! You'll regret this! You can't do this to me!" Passengers recoiled. Some covered their ears. Others turned their backs, unwilling to be dragged into her meltdown. At last, the cabin doors opened once more. Two uniformed airport security officers stepped into the VIP section. "Mrs. Stokes," one of them said calmly, "you're being asked to leave the aircraft immediately. Please collect your belongings." "No!" Evelyn screamed. "You can't remove me! This is my flight. I paid for it. I have rights." The officers didn't argue. They moved in, firm but professional, taking her gently by the arms. Evelyn thrashed, then pleaded, then sobbed. But nothing worked. Her reign of entitlement had ended. As she was escorted down the aisle, she turned one last time, her eyes full of hatred, and pointed a trembling finger at Malik. "This is your fault," she spat. "All of this." But Malik didn't flinch. He remained seated, back straight, eyes calm. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stared forward, dignity intact. When the doors finally closed behind Evelyn, a collective breath seemed to release throughout the plane. The tension broke. Passengers exhaled, relaxed, and looked to one another in relief. Mr. Evans approached Malik's seat, eyes soft with respect. "Malik," he said gently, "on behalf of the entire airline, I want to apologize for everything. No passenger should ever be treated the way you were. We will make changes, and we thank you for your composure through it all." Malik nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted to travel in peace, like everyone else." And finally, for the first time that morning, peace had returned. The captain's voice came through the speakers a few moments later. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now ready for takeoff." As the plane lifted off into the sky, Malik looked out the window, his reflection blending with the clouds. He hadn't just held his seat, he had held his ground. The engines roared softly as the aircraft climbed into the clouds, slicing through the morning sky like a new beginning. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. Not the uneasy silence from before, but a quiet born of relief. The ordeal was over, or at least it seemed to be. Malik sat in seat 1A, the same place where everything had started. Yet now it felt different, not because of the leather seat beneath him or the window view that stretched endlessly into the horizon, but because of something heavier, something deeper. He had endured a storm without raising his voice. He had resisted humiliation without a fight. He had faced a battle not of fists or fury, but of dignity. Across the aisle, Mr. Evans remained seated, watching Malik with a subtle awe. Few adults would have managed what that boy had just done. The crew had failed. The system had failed. But Malik, he hadn't. And that fact hung in the air, like the faint scent of justice finally served. A soft voice interrupted the quiet. "Excuse me?" A middle-aged woman in 1C leaned over gently, her eyes filled with warmth. "You were incredibly brave. I just wanted to say thank you. My granddaughter, she's about your age. Watching you made me hopeful." Malik looked at her, a quiet smile lifting the corner of his lips. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his voice still calm, still steady. "I just did what I thought was right." And somehow that truth, spoken so simply, hit harder than any speech ever could. Throughout the cabin, other passengers began to approach him. A man in business attire gave him a nod of deep respect. A young couple offered him a thumbs up. Even a flight attendant, different from the ones before, brought him a warm towel and whispered an apology, her eyes downcast with shame. Then came a quiet knock on the cabin wall. The curtain parted slightly. It was Captain Reynolds. Still in uniform, posture sharp, eyes steady, but this time with a softness that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Malik Thompson," he said, addressing the boy with the respect usually reserved for diplomats or dignitaries. "May I?" Malik nodded. The captain crouched slightly to Malik's level, voice low but firm. "I want to commend you, not just for standing your ground, but for doing it with restraint, honor, and grace. It was not only the right thing, it was the powerful thing." Malik's eyes didn't shine with pride. Instead, they held something pure: resolve, humility. "Thank you, Captain. I didn't want a scene. I just wanted to be treated fairly." Reynolds gave a single nod. "And because of you," he said, "this entire airline is about to change." By the time the plane touched down, word had already spread. Malik's father, Preston Thompson, the CEO of one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast, had released a statement praising not only his son's composure, but calling for a full-scale review of discriminatory practices in the airline industry. Within 48 hours, the airline held a press conference. The headline spread across news networks and social media. "Youth stands ground against discrimination. Airline launches national reform program." Malik didn't appear at the press conference. He didn't need to. He had said everything he needed to say by not giving up his seat. Instead, he returned to school that week, slipping quietly back into his routine. But something was different. His classmates looked at him not with awe, but with admiration. Teachers mentioned the story during morning announcements. A local journalist requested an interview. He politely declined. He hadn't done it for attention. He'd done it for his right to exist with dignity. A week later, a small letter arrived in the mail. It wasn't from a government official or an airline executive. It was handwritten, scrawled in neat, careful penmanship. "Dear Malik, I saw what you did. I'm 10 years old and sometimes people treat me like I don't belong. My mom showed me your story. Now I know I can be strong too. Thank you. Jordan." Malik folded the letter gently, placed it in his journal, and closed the cover. That letter meant more than any press headline, because in that moment he knew what he endured had echoed beyond the confines of one airplane. It had soared. Morale of the story dignity is not low, but it is undeniable. Malik didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight fire with fire, but he didn't back down either. And in doing so, he reminded an entire plane and the world watching that true power doesn't need to scream. Sometimes it just needs to sit and stay.